Today we have Professor Douglas Allen with us, and we're going to be speaking on the role of technology in eliminating the extremes of wealth and poverty. So I want to go ahead and give a quick bio on our guest speaker. Douglas Allen is an associate professor of management at the University of Denver, where he joined in 1989. He has been a staple and director of the Daniels College International MBA program. He's lived a very international life, beginning when he was 8 years old in 1963, when he went to visit his grandparents in formerly Swaziland, which is now Eswatini, and got to spend about 5 years of his childhood in visiting his grandparents, who were longtime pioneers there, and later his parents who pioneered in Botswana and Lesotho. That's right. And he's also lived in several countries overseas, and he's worked and traveled in 60 countries, primarily in Africa and China. So he spent much of his life abroad, and thanks to his mother and father, who raised him in the Baha'i faith, which encourages world unity and understanding. His beliefs in the Baha'i faith have been a guiding principle in conflict resolution and increasingly in business management. And Dr. Allen has a PhD in business administration from the University of Michigan. He has his MBA from Harvard University and a BS in sociology from the University of Zimbabwe. So we're so happy I'm so happy to get to chat with you today and to share your wisdom with the audience that will be getting to look at this interview.
Yeah, so,
yay. So first question, I wanted to read off a little part of a statement from the Baha'i International Community regarding the elimination of extremes of poverty and wealth. So in its 2005 report on the world social situation, the United Nations highlighted the growing chasm between formal and informal economies, the widening gap between skilled and unskilled workers, and the growing disparities in health, education, as well as in opportunities for social, economic, and political participation. It has been well documented that the focus on growth and income generation has not necessarily translated into significant social improvements, and that growing inequality has rendered the global community increasingly unstable and insecure. So, in reflection of this reality, Doug mentioned in this statement, and in your opinion, considering the tremendous advancements in technology, why do the inequalities still remain widespread? And then, big question following that, can technology solve the problem of poverty? In your opinion?
Well, first of all, this is one of the important questions, I think, right now, as we kind of look at the world situation, this growing level of inequality, which has, it's a very complex topic, because we can talk about how technology has actually improved the lot of many people in the world, and also we can talk about how technology has increased the inequality in the world, has concentrated wealth further among the wealthy, oftentimes at the expense of the less wealthy individuals in the world. And we can also talk about how technology has probably failed to deliver its promise in terms of solving some of the economic problems of the world. And I think the starting point from a Baha'i perspective is that these technologies have been developed with a material perspective rather than a balance between a perspective of economic and material considerations, as well as social and spiritual considerations. And so in that mode, you have companies who are developing technologies primarily with, in many cases, not always, but primarily with a profit motive. And so you figure out what technologies can generate the most wealth for shareholders and for the company. And oftentimes, the answer to that question is different than if you were asking the question, what technologies could be developed to solve the, the economic problems of the world. So I think it would be inaccurate to say that technologies have not helped alleviate poverty to a certain extent. We can see some examples, and probably we'll have some opportunity to talk about some of those examples as we move forward. But I think the general defect in the system as it now exists is that technologies are developed primarily with a profit motive in mind, as opposed to a service motive for humanity. Of course, it's not a dichotomous choice. There probably has to be elements of both.
Mm. Okay, great. Thank you for sharing that. So this is good, because the next questions are going to kind of touch on examples of what you mentioned. So another piece of the Baha'i International Community Statement I want to share is, today most of the world's people live in societies characterized by relationships of dominance. Actually, I'm going to skip to the next question, and I'm going to hope Reese edits this. But because since you mentioned the material perspective, we are living in so this is a question. We are living in a society that economically depends on vigorous consumerism and has reduced concepts of values and human purpose to mere materialism. How has this economic model and view of humanity shaped the technology development and technologies we use? And how can tech developers rethink technologies in such a way that they work for the betterment of humanity and not against it? So some examples there would be great.
Okay, so again, I think that follows nicely from the previous discussion, that at the end of the day, right now, we kind of have an economy that subscribes to the trickle-down theory, that if we develop new technologies or new products for early adopters who can afford to pay for them, then as the economies of scale grow, those products become more affordable to a larger population of the people. And there, as I say, there are examples of where that can work. Mobile phone technology is one that's often cited as an example of that. Now that technology is only a few decades old, but probably has spread as a technology, perhaps spread more quickly to the world's population than just about anything else. I think the estimate is that about 7 billion people now use cell phones. A large portion of those are now becoming smartphones. And lots of interesting data on the economic impact of those cell phones in the hands of individuals. And yet, at the end of the day, that technology was designed initially, for sort of an elite group of people who would be carrying around, conducting their business on mobile phones, and only later, almost as an afterthought, perhaps partly as a vision of where it would head, it became something that could be used by the generality of humankind. Still recognizing that perhaps 2 billion people or so are without that technology as we move around the world. But what seemed at first like sort of a luxury has now become a valuable tool for much of the world's population. In parts of Africa, that's how banking is conducted. You have many individuals who are part of the so-called unbanked population without a banking account and now without the benefits of that. But they can carry out transactions that basically replace the need for a bank account through M-Pesa or other kinds of mobile payment technologies that have been developed. And that, for small entrepreneurs, for people living out in villages, can be a game changer in terms of economic empowerment and economic possibility. So that would be an example of where technology has probably worked in in a rather positive way. Of course, there are many social discussions that we can have about the pros and cons of that kind of technology. Other things, though, have rolled out in much less equitable fashion. I think the COVID vaccine would be one example of that, where the technology performed very, very well. But then sort of the industrialized countries scooped up much of that vaccine. In many cases, they were the funders of the work that had gone into that vaccine. And so they felt that it was justified that they basically consider their populations first. But I have to say that when I went for my jab, when it was available to myself, probably in March of 2021 or whenever it was, I had mixed feelings. I was very grateful to be able to take advantage of this amazing technology. But I was just, feeling a little bit uncomfortable that I was getting that benefit before the hospital worker in Zimbabwe was getting that benefit, because much of the benefit of that had not extended to many other countries in the world. And so, one issue is the issue of the development of the technology. Another is the issue of access to that technology, whether it be medical or whether it be other kinds of tech stuff.
So yes, do you have maybe one or two more examples about how we can rethink those technologies in a way? Like you mentioned some great examples of inequalities. Yeah, do you have any thoughts or ideas about that? I mean, these are big questions, but
they are. So I'll give a really big answer, and then we can drill down from there. But sometimes I think that we have to kind of decide what assumptions we make about the world we live in, we have this overarching assumption right now that the world works best in a market economy, and that is an economy where people who can afford to buy things, and the products are available on a mutually negotiated basis, and that's all beautiful. And oftentimes for a portion of the world's population, that is a reasonably effective system. But I would say that at the end of the day, the analogy that comes to my mind is, as we think about the world, are we living in a candy store or a lifeboat? If we want to go for the candy store example, when I was let's say an elementary school student, going to school, I would be walking home past this little candy store with my friends, and we'd each been given some kind of allowance from our parents, or maybe a couple of us didn't have anything that day, but those who had a bit of allowance could buy some candy in that candy store, and it was perfectly fine. If my friend had, more than I did, he got a bigger candy bar that day. If I had nothing that day, maybe he would share it, but it was at his discretion, and it was fair because we all had our thing. And to me, that's kind of the market system at work. Whoever can afford to buy stuff gets to buy stuff. And so if I'm wealthy enough to afford a car, I get to buy a car. And if I'm not wealthy enough to buy a car, that's how the market system works. If we find ourselves in a lifeboat, though, we make different decisions. We begin planning for the future. We want to make sure that everybody survives and lives to tell the story at the end of the day. And so all of a sudden, the status of millionaire or person with no resources at all makes no difference as we figure out how we allocate the resources on the lifeboat to make sure that everybody survives. Now, I'm not suggesting that survival is our highest aspiration, and we want to thrive, but we could still kind of use that sense to figure out what is a just allocation of resources in the world. And I would think that the candy store model doesn't achieve that. At times, the candy store model might kick in at a certain level after basics have been achieved for everybody. The principle in the Baha'i faith is not equality of resources, but the elimination of extremes of poverty and wealth. And so it may be that some hybrid model that embraces some of each of those kinds of things, starting with the assumption that we need to make sure that the basic amenities required for a prosperous life are available for all. in the world. And then to the extent that there is surplus, we are allocating that surplus based on talent, based on contribution, based on capabilities, which then provides a system that is still recognizing different contributions that people are making. Although we've got to probably recalibrate how we value contributions, because right now I think the world skews heavily towards business as the place that contributions are made, whereas I think that we might argue very clearly that the contribution of a teacher or a social worker or a government employee is equally important. And so there's probably a lot of recalibrating to do in terms of how we value contribution to society, but there's still a recognition that that's a worthwhile sort of differentiation at times. And then there's a responsibility of individuals to be moderate in terms of how they carry out their own lifestyle, how they make choices about what to do, to be sure that even if they have the wealth to do so, they're not consuming more than their fair share of the Earth's resources. And if we begin thinking in those terms, I think we have a new paradigm to work on, and we're nowhere close to it. And the Baha'i faith doesn't simply say, here's the solution, but they say, here is the direction in which we could head. And now let's take on a learning attitude to kind of run some experiments, try some things, and learn from that experience. As we say, study, consult, act, and reflect. And if we can do that in a fairly rapid cycle, we can make progress very quickly.
Awesome. I'm so glad you brought that last part up, and that was a really helpful analogy. I think the last part, talking about being in a learning mode, kind of connects to this question of kind of the current state of society today, which we've talked about a little bit. In this other piece of the Baha'i International Community Statement that I wanted to share is about how we are living in a state of dominance, or where societies are characterized by relationships of dominance, right? And I immediately thought of my experience with the COVID vaccine living in Colombia, in Bogota, where we had, I had lots of friends in the embassy who were getting the shots like right away. And and then of course my family who were getting the shots here in the United States, and I had to wait, way after that. I can't remember. It was like 3 or 6 months after that. And then it was lining up in these long lines out on the street. Even if you had kids, even if you had, you'd have to wait for hours and hours and hours. And I'm thinking about, how the population was really compliant with that. And I really feel like, this relationship of dominance is very apparent in that culture that I was living, and in all cultures we see that, right? Whether it be in this statement, it talks about whether it be one nation over another, one race by another, one social class by another, one religious ethnic group by another, one sex by another. So the statement says, in this context, the discourse on the elimination of the extremes of poverty and wealth presumes that societies cannot flourish in an environment that fuels inequitable access to resources, to knowledge, and to meaningful participation in the life of society. So I guess I feel like being in the learning mode kind of connects to this, but in your opinion and thoughts, what is the role of technology in empowering different sections of society to become protagonists of change in their communities?
Well, I think there's probably a short-term and a long-term answer to that. There's probably many more answers too, but in the short term, technology certainly provides a level of access to information and resources that is unprecedented in the history of the world. And that in itself is a game changer, I think, in terms of helping to begin to change the power dynamics in the society. As an example, with the mobile phone, you have in many parts of the world, in the developing world, smallhold farmers that are just eking out enough productivity from their farms to kind of get to the point where they can sell part of their crop and make it just surviving through the year. And so historically, part of what would happen is as the crops were being harvested, the middlemen would come in and say, here's the price that we'll pay you for your crops. And, very much a power dominant role. And back in the olden days, meaning 10 or 15 years, when there were no cell phones, all you could do is say yes or no, basically, to this person, because you had no idea what the crops were going for, the grain was going for in town, where the market was, or anything like that. So your choice was either to say yes to these people or figure out some alternative, maybe very difficult, maybe very uncertain way of selling your crop in some other venue. And so these middlemen had very, very asymmetrical power over all of these people. Now, today, or, after mobile phone, what does that same farmer do? They say, oh, let me just call up my friend in Bogota and find out what, corn is going for right now. And 2 minutes later says, sorry, he says it's 3 times what you're telling me. So my price is X, or I'll take it into town. And so, all of a sudden, that immediate access to information, that's a very simple example, but that immediate access to information is a game changer in terms of how people can interact with each other. Fishermen off the coast of Kerala, India, would, in the olden days, 10 or 15, 20 years ago, have to basically catch their fish offshore and then decide which of maybe 2 or 3 towns they had choices to go into would be the best place to go. And if they all chose the same place, all of a sudden there would be all kinds of surplus and wastage and very low prices and maybe a shortage in the other places. But with a quick mobile phone call, you could find out where is the best place to go and head for that port. And prices for consumers went down, profits for the fishermen went up, and wastage decreased, all through absolutely the advent of that. So those are just those are short-term, I think, examples of how technology is changing today. One observer said that a Maasai warrior walking the plains of Kenya with a smartphone has more access to information than the president of the United States did 30 years ago. And I should be holding it out in front of me for the smartphone usage, but that's an amazing statement, isn't it? And I can tell you that I have run into those very Maasai warriors on the plains of not Kenya but Tanzania, who would say, "Would you like to be my Facebook friend?" And so literally those technologies have reached masses of people, but not all of humankind. Sometimes, by the way, with very bad side effects that we can talk about too. But that's the short-term kind of stuff, is making sure that we have access to these technologies that allow people to take advantage of the benefits that are there. But at the end of the day, those technologies right now have been designed by kind of elite companies for elite audiences, and kind of by happenstance, those things have been ported down to much broader portions of the population. And I think a longer term answer to your question about how technologies can help solve these problems is that that individuals, the generality of humankind, the communities in Uganda, have to be involved in, even before we talk about design, assessing what problems they think need to be solved. That's something that should be local communities reading their own reality and figuring that out. And it could be that some technology will be helpful for that, or it could be that some other solution will be useful. And so I think we need to change the whole paradigm of tech design, where it doesn't start with some engineers in a lab working for one of the Magnificent Seven companies, but instead starts out in the field with communities kind of assessing their reality on the ground, and then beginning to kind of work through what that will be, oftentimes with experts who will be available to provide technological help or other kinds of things, but not imposing those solutions on a community unless they've decided that's something that's a priority for them.
Great. Love that. Okay, well, let's move on to the next question here. So another little piece of the Baha'i International Community Statement. The fact is that technology itself does nothing for or against poverty or wealth or success of any other outcome at all. What creates poverty or economic gain is how technology is used. Moreover, this recognition puts the responsibility squarely upon the shoulders of those who create and use technology in technologically driven systems. So how do we address this divide? The fact that technology tends to provide great wealth and opportunity for a few while creating poverty and limitations for others. You've touched on this a little.
So I think that this is not a bad time to just kind of think about what are the guardrails that that society needs to have. This question has come up with AI right now, and these new technologies that are being developed that are, related to artificial intelligence. And we see this rapid running of these companies to try to get to the market first with their products. And oftentimes there's concern that shortcuts may be being taken that compromise the safety and reliability of these products. Not because these are bad people who are intentionally unconcerned about the welfare of others, but they're driven by this profit motive. If your investors have put $10 billion into a technology, they're expecting a return on that. And in order to get a return on that, there's a very strong advantage of being first to market, because you can kind of drive that share with that. See how quickly ChatGPT kind of rose to fame because they were first with something that was accessible to the masses. So the combination of this strong incentive, profit incentive to kind of move quickly, and then the inherent need to move quickly in order to be a first mover, I think leads to some of the distortions that we see in the market. Again, these are examples of problems in the market, not a complete analysis, but that general sense of movement encourages companies to create what has been well recognized as sort of a gap between technological development and sort of the social and spiritual guardrails that need to go along with that. And I think guardrails may even be limiting in terms of the concept, because we actually want not just guardrails for the technology, but we actually want technologies that have been designed to really allow individuals who use them or benefit from them to flourish. So it's not just kind of holding this stuff within, so that's an important part of it, but it's also making sure that the design is achieving the full benefit that it's intended. So until that whole system changes, we have this challenge. And I think it begins with probably redefining how tech development takes place, and with companies putting equal proportionate resources behind the social development of the system, as well as the technical development of the system, so that we are really explicitly thinking not just as kind of a check on the box, but as a equally important part of the development process, to be sure that we're designing reliable and trustworthy products as we do that. So that's a major shift in kind of the motive of development that I think would at least help address the concern that the Baha'i international community is raising in their article.
Well, it sounds like you're describing more of a framework than you mentioned guardrails might not be sufficient to talk about how to keep us in these like agreed upon framework, a spiritual and economic.
So I do think that's exactly right. That and the Baha'i use that word framework quite a lot, and a framework implies sort of a broad set of parameters that we operate within, the values behind what we're doing, even the assumptions about human nature is part of that framework, the inherent nobility of each individual. If we're designing technology that will be used by noble beings, how is that different than if we're designing technology for passive consumers of that technology, who can't really think about that technology for themselves, and so they get what is provided. So it is a very different thing, but it reaches into a lot of different elements. When we're back to that technology, exacerbating some of the distribution of wealth right now with the advent of these large language model AI systems. How do you train those? There even today in the New York Times, there's an article about all the it's in one of the Harvard publications about all the negotiations that are taking place, because more and more companies are suing these large language model companies because they're using their copyrighted material to train the large language models for that. So what is the fair and just allocation of the benefit of that training? Who gets to choose whether their material is used for training or not? Those questions, I think, are a little bit being considered further along in the EU, the European Union, than they are in the United States. But those are hot issues right now all over the place, and the answers to those questions probably need that same process of action, reflection, and kind of see how it works out, with an opportunity to pivot quickly as we learn from our experience. Because on one hand, these technologies offer tremendous potential for solving problems in the world, helping us diagnose diseases, helping us even solve thorny problems like climate change with some of the ability to aggregate information in various ways. But we also have to think about the rights and responsibilities that come along with these technologies, and make sure that people don't get left behind.
Yeah, that kind of goes into the next question really well. I'm glad you brought up nobility. I feel like that's inherent, like recognizing inherent nobility kind of really sets the stage for this problem of consumerism, capitalistic consumerism leading our thoughts, changes that. But also, I lost my train of thought. Okay, the next question, I think you just answered it. But although the necessary technologies exist to eradicate most of the pressing issues in the world, which you mentioned that we have a lot of great technologies that are doing great things, do we need to change priorities by which technologies are being developed, adopted, and invested in? Yeah.
I think the answer is yes. We need a new set of priorities based on the framework that we were talking about. That if we believe that work done in the spirit of service is a form of worship, that kind of recasts my role as an employee in an organization. It also recasts my role as an owner of an organization, and what I want those resources to be going towards. And I think that part of the kind of redefining of priorities is literally that fundamental, that we want to. I don't think that I'm not aware of anywhere in the Baha'i writings that objects to businesses making a profit. That's not something that is contained in the Baha'i faith, as far as I know. But there is an emphasis on moderation, and there is also an emphasis on this spirit of service to others. And so if we began kind of redefining how we use the resources of the world in a spirit of service, and then we kind of set the scene for very different choices to be made. Whether we're pharmaceutical companies or whether we're an AI large language model company.
Okay, now you reminded me what I forgot. You had mentioned those AI examples and the lawsuits at a high level, and if we, like what you mentioned, if we had a different framework, it wouldn't be about it, and we were in the spirit of service. It wouldn't be so much about whose property is who. We're learning from each other, basically. We wouldn't have all these the problem of lawsuits, I think, wouldn't exist so much, right? That we're in a learning mode when it comes to these technologies, and how do these technologies serve different populations. So I guess that was what you mentioned just now reminded me of that.
Yeah, so I think that there'll still be important questions about how we equitably kind of distribute the benefits that come from a new technology. I mean, like for instance, right now the AI models are primarily sometimes offering their services for free, but oftentimes charging for those services, and so benefiting from all of the material that went into the training process. So there's one discussion around that. But even if we decide that at the end of the day, all of the things have been designed to be in service of humanity, we still have to decide how the contributors to that are equitably compensated, whether they're workers, whether they're generators of content that went into the training. There's a lot of stakeholders that need to be considered. And I think there's a lot of learning that needs to go into how that makes sense. Right now, a lot of the technologies ultimately are adopted by companies, largely attractive because of productivity improvement. And productivity meaning that you might be able to employ fewer employees and still do many things. And so there's a differentiation between technology that is job enabling and technology that is job replacing. And so that becomes another, framework to explore. When is it appropriate to replace a job? How do we compensate that worker or help that worker move on to another sort of thing? So for the last 5 years, I've been teaching a course that was originally called AI, Robotics, and the Future of Work, looking at the organizational and societal impact of these technologies through the lens of managers that we're training at the business school. So we said that if you're a manager, you need to be thinking about these second and third order impacts as you make decisions about these technologies. And what we kind of have seen over that time is there are many different components that need to go into these kind of decisions that managers will be making. But if the main parameter is productivity, that gets in the way of making decisions about other kinds of benefits that might be offered, or times when maybe lower productivity is actually desirable. I think that we would all agree that there are many jobs that could be improved or replaced for the benefit of humankind. We took our students over to an autonomous vehicle lab at our engineering school, where one of the doctoral students was working on a landmine finder detector, robotic autonomous vehicle that could move through former battlefields to find the landmines and then remove them. And I don't think there was a person in my class that thought that was a job that they would prefer to save for a human. So there are the so-called 3D jobs, dirty, dangerous, and dull jobs that could either be improved or eliminated through technology. That would probably be to the benefit of humankind. But we have to be sure that that benefit doesn't blind us from the trauma that can be experienced by employees who are displaced by those new technologies en route perhaps to new jobs and new economic opportunities in the future. But that future is oftentimes not 2 years away, it may be 50 years away. And so the beneficiaries of that transition are not the people who've been put out of the job. So how do we make sure that there's a just transition for the people who are involved in the transition now, as opposed to simply dreaming of the utopia to come?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I want to I think we have one more question. If you have any closing thoughts after answering this question, just to kind of close the interview, how can technology contribute to creating a balance in the flow of knowledge throughout the world? And any relevant examples that might come to mind there?
That's a really interesting one. I was involved in a project a few years ago where we were looking at information needs of smallhold farmers. I happened to be on part of the project in Mali and Zambia, and we were also, another team was in Southeast Asia. And what we very early on, we felt that the the question of information needs could be very easily identified as, what do these farmers need in order to improve the productivity of their farms and that sort of thing, these very close to subsistence level farmers. But then we very quickly concluded that that was a pretty ethnocentric way of framing the question. And so instead of asking the question of, the problem of the last mile, how do we get information out to these smallhold farmers, which has been, a challenge for many decades. I mean, a very legitimate challenge. How can information about, pests and, water and other kinds of things be transferred? We said, actually, let's reframe this as the problem of the first kilometer. In other words, the first kilometer being the ability of the farmer to contribute information that can then be used by the community or a broader common group of people. So instead of looking at the farmers as passive recipients of information and basically benefiting from that for sure, empowering them to actually be contributors to the knowledge of the community. So at the time, again, handheld phones looked like a promising technology, and they've absolutely turned out to be that 10 or 15 years later. But the concept would be that, if you had, a network of farmers contributing information to a point that could aggregate that and then send that out, sometimes even by radio or other technologies, maybe SMS, maybe on a smartphone, all of a sudden you have a much more powerful system than some central generator of knowledge that is disseminating it out to there. So notice how the same technology can be used in two very different ways, depending on the framework that you're looking at. So that would be an example, I think, that might change a number of different things. We were talking before about how people have access to knowledge now that they did not have access to before. The fact that your smartphone, if you have a broadband line, can give you access to all kinds of information that could be helpful beyond our needs. So then another problem becomes, how do we critically look at that information we're accessing and decide whether it's accurate, whether it's trustworthy? That requires universal education, another principle of the Baha'i faith. If we have well-educated individuals who've been trained to think as empowered individuals who are critically assessing the information that they're receiving, may be trained in the process that the Baha'is call consultation, where everybody contributes to a group understanding of truth, and then a collective decision is made based on that common contribution coming from the different individuals. Those kinds of processes can really change the paradigm of how people look at information, assess information, and ultimately use that information. But there's a long way to go. Those are a few early examples, though. But I think that technology can play a tremendous role in shrinking the distance in the world. I can teach a course. I was literally via Zoom, because it was during the pandemic, teaching a course that I teach at the Tongji University in Shanghai. And one of the international students, also isolated because of the pandemic, was an individual from Mozambique who was taking the course from there. And so we're all having this conversation, primarily people in Shanghai, myself here at this very desk that I'm sitting in now, and a few international students in Kazakhstan, Mozambique, Singapore, and other places, all having a conversation. And then that Mozambique student has stayed in touch with me since that time. And we have conversations that are no different than the conversation that we're having right now, which is already an interesting example of that small neighborhood that we live in. So those technologies can really bring us together, but we have to be careful, because those technologies can also pull us apart, because it might get tempting for me to contact my neighbor 2 doors down the street via Zoom and make that the basis of our relationship, as opposed to the face-to-face wonders of having a coffee together or something like that. So we want to make choices. I think that at the end of the day, the answer to this question is no different than many other tech questions, and that is that we need to make good choices about how we use these technologies. And there was a great book that was written a number of years ago that basically asked the question, Now that we can do anything, what will we do? Okay, so instead of implying that just because we can do anything, we'll do anything. No, now that we can do anything, we have an amazing array of choices, but we've got to be careful and thoughtful about how we make those choices and do the things that will help us advance and be more successful as a human race, an ever advancing civilization. But at the same time, make sure that we don't just adopt stuff just because we can do it, because there's a lot of stuff we can do that will probably harm us in that quest for moving our society forward.
Thank you so much, Doug, Dr. Allen. Thank you so much for
good.
Thank you so much for your valuable insights and your sharing your experience today. We really appreciate it, and I'm sure it will be fascinating to the audience. So thank you so much.
Well, I don't think we've covered a lot of answers to these questions, but hopefully raise some issues that will stimulate some further thinking. And then the audience that is listening in, to this and the other recordings that have been created in this series, hopefully that will inspire people to conduct their own experiments, their own efforts to kind of learn about these issues, and then, benefit from that learning and move things forward for everybody.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's a great way to close. Okay.